Hello everyone, my name is TGilkes, and today I will be presenting the court case of the state of New York versus Harris. Here are some facts of the case as well as some problems. The defendant is Brigitte Harris, the victim is Eric Goodridge, and the actions that brought about the case was that Goodridge was smothered and mutilated by Harris, which resulted in fatal injuries. The crime in question is murder in the second degree and manslaughter in the first degree. And the problem that I found with the case was that previous abuse from the father was not taken into consideration during sentencing. Here's some research that I found pertinent to the case. We have 3 journal articles, and we're going to start with journal article number 1, which is titled Risk Factors for PTSD and Depression in Female Survivors of Rape. So typically what happens after a person, specifically a woman, experiences some type of sexual trauma such as rape or assault, is that it can, and when she goes on to lead her everyday life, certain things that occur in her everyday life can trigger memories of the assault or the attack, and it can cause them to become very stressed out. It's very stressing on the body, and when they are unable to get help for their issues out of the risk of having to tell someone over and over again, or just out of fear of not getting any help or being judged, they can develop a sense of helplessness and hopelessness, which can also turn into depression. We see and we talk about PTSD a lot with soldiers who experience trauma on the battlefield, and how little things can trigger them, like hearing a firecracker can suddenly bring them back into experiencing and into seeing like someone get killed on the field, or in some type of traumatic event like that. But it also can be understood when it comes to women experiencing some type of assault. My example of that would be someone like grabbing their arm, and they're suddenly, in their mind, it suddenly goes back to when they were assaulted. So little things like that in their everyday lives can trigger traumatic events, and it can cause them to not only experience severe mood swings and depression, but it can also cause them to make very irrational decisions or actions based off of emotion or whatever they're going through in that moment, which is they're usually not always having very logical thoughts. Like their thoughts aren't coming from a place of clear thinking, if you will. My second journal is titled Secondary Victimization of Rape Victims, Insights from Mental Health Professionals Who Treat Survivors of Rape. So this journal article in particular highlights what rape victims go through when retelling this story or the trauma that they went through the lens of the mental health professionals that treat them. And what this particular journal article found is that many victims do not like coming forward because they find having to retell their story over and over again to so many people, be it law enforcement, the mental health professionals who provide the help and healing that they need mentally, or telling it over to a doctor or a friend. It can be very traumatizing. And another word for second victimization is called re-victimization. And it can be very difficult to have to keep going back and forth. And the reason why I used this article in particular was because during the trial, it was revealed that Brigitte Harris suffered from a lot of mental health issues from the trauma that she went through, and it was very difficult for her to reach out and get help because she had to constantly retell the story over and over and over again, which in turn caused her to not only not receive help, but when she realized that her nieces were going back with her father to 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 her home, to their home, and I believe it is in Africa, she essentially got very irate, and it caused her to make a very irrational decision based off of emotion in that time when she was not in in a good place mentally to make a clear logical judgment. So the second article that I have, well, I'm sorry, the third article that I have is called Incest and Abuse of Children. This journal article in particular highlights what children go through when trying to get help from an adult after being assaulted or abused by either an adult, another adult, or close friend, or even someone the same age as them. And what this article found was that many children do not like to, just like with women experiencing rape, children do not like to retell or revisit stories of, or basically retell stories of when they were abused, because it's really hard for them to recount. And um, sometimes when the mind is in such a fragile state, it can also affect memory. And so even if the child is telling the truth, it can cause adults to question them even more. And one thing that the article highlighted is that um, adults have a tendency to take away the authority of a child when recounting a story because they think that their memory isn't very good. This was this article in particular stuck out to me as it pertained to the case because Brigitte Harris did try to tell people what was going on about her abuse. And even when she confronted her father said, you know, you were really young around that time and I don't think you remember what happened. So in taking away her authority to tell her story and what happened, it caused her to become irrational and to essentially feel as though the only way that she could stop him from causing more hurt and more harm was to essentially take his life. And here are the journal articles applied to the text a little bit more further in. So with the journal article number 1, my my overall finding was that trauma from rape can lead to PTSD and depression, which can have long lasting effects on one's mental state, including the ability to lead a normal life. Now, when we think about the word normal, we have to ask ourselves what exactly is normal. And the application from that I put as it pertains to the case when I put it alongside one another was that PTSD and depression played a major role in Harris's life. It was a lifelong thing that she experienced from the trauma from when she was a child. However, despite the traumatic events from her past, Harris was able to lead a normal life and be a contributing member to society. And this was something that should have been taken into consideration during the case because the prosecutors essentially tried to make it look like she was a troublemaker her whole life and that she never essentially got a good footing. They used the fact that she never really got a good footing mentally to say that she was never a good person. And that essentially was not true because even though she went through all of this trauma and by someone who was supposed to essentially protect her, she was still able to lead a normal life and get a job and be a good person to society. She wasn't a very social individual, but she did make some friends in the time that she was living her life before the crime was committed. Sexual trauma also contributed with also combined with constant abuse from her family members and an unstable household. The One of the biggest things that I found during my research with the case was Bridget Harris not only experienced trauma from one side, from one side of the family. She experienced it from both sides essentially, because after she was being abused by her father, she then went to go on and live with her grandmother, and she was abused by her relatives in that household. So after being traumatized once, she was then being constantly traumatized over and over again until she was essentially able to get out and work for herself and be able to leave the home. The defense attorney was immediately sympathetic towards her. This case was a really big deal. It actually made national headlines because this was someone who was essentially a victim of their circumstances, and they really felt as though there was nothing they could do besides making such a huge and permanent decision to take someone's life. And she had made several attempts to persuade her sister to not send her nieces with her father. But however, the the mother of those two children weren't essentially wasn't interested in listening, and for that reason she felt as though she had to protect them, and that's what she decided to do. Whether it was ethical to take someone's life, I often question whether or not does the life of an what does the saving does the life of another person, is it more valuable than the life of someone else? And I think that's a really big question when you consider all of the things that the father had done to his daughters. Because another thing that wasn't brought up until later on in the case was that Harris's sister was also abused by her father as well, but chose, knowing everything that had happened in the past, she chose to send her children with their grandfather. And that's a really big deal, because she did receive a huge outpour of support from people, even local politicians who heard about her case and felt as though she should be able to walk and not spend any time in jail. The second application, medical providers, law enforcement, and mental health counselors failed to provide assistance to survivors of rape, re-victimizing them more than once more. So, like I was talking about it earlier when I was going into more detail about the application on on the application on the page, when Harris would try to tell. Well, let's take a step back. When a person has been a victim of rape, or abuse or anything of that nature, there is an initial outpour of support from law officials, enforcement, mental health counselors, detectives, people who it's essentially their job to provide such support to those people. However, there's two things that we don't think about. One, they have to constantly recount and tell their story over and over and over again, just so that everyone has a clear view of what happened, and to make sure that the victim maintains the same story so that it doesn't change. And I'm guessing this is just to test their memory, but in doing that, they're being re-victimized over and over again. And another thing as well is these resources of support are usually pulled once the case is over or once the case gets going. There's not a lot of those people reaching out and offering any type of help at any capacity, besides some resources that may be given at the end, and they're usually very limited. Another thing is that survivors of rape can feel judged or shamed by the providers, and I've I've heard stories and I've even read articles of law enforcement asking women or asking people about their sexual history, their past, or whether was liquor a part of the situation, what was going on. And this can cause anyone really to not want to go forward with pressing charges, or even going to the police about their assault, out of fear of being asked questions that essentially undermine them as human beings. And with that, it also creates this lack of trust between the law enforcement, the mental health providers, and the doctors, and the victims. So here is my application to the case. So the lack of resources based on socioeconomic status and risk of re-victimization and attempting to get help. This was this part stuck out to me the most because Harris did not grow up in a household that provided basic essentials. So even trying to get help for for the things that her father did to her, she wasn't able to afford it because her family just did not was not able to provide that monetary resource. And also, her when she would tell this to family members and other people, they wouldn't believe her. So it was she at one point she just became silent, didn't say anything about it. Harris attempted to seek mental health counseling but was unable to find resources for her specific needs. And speaking of from my last statement, she actually did try to go and get mental health counseling, but she found that a lot of the resources that were out there simply was just not helping her in the way that she needed help. And for that reason, she stopped trying to get help. But it should be noted that she really did try. She also developed a drinking problem to cope with her drama, with her trauma, which is unfortunately a common thing that we see with people who have experienced some type of trauma. They usually use some type of coping mechanism, be it drugs or some type of substance, to kind of numb themselves to get away from whatever they're feeling. And I don't know if this was a sign that people saw, but it definitely was one that was noted when the case began, when the trial began. Despite having a social life, she had a difficulty being around people. She was not very much. She was a people person and not a people person. She didn't really care to be around people very often, and when she was, it was usually in a social setting where she was able to drink. She didn't make a lot of friends. The statutes of limitation had ran out on Harris's case, and she was unable to press charges against her father. And I believe she did try, and by the time everything was said and done, she wasn't able to. And here is my application for my journal article number 3. In some situations of sexual abuse, children are not only the victim but are blamed for the actions of the adult. And this is actually a common thing when an adult commits a crime of sexual abuse towards a child. They will blame the child for for their actions. And this is a very nonsensical argument because children, as we presume them, do not have the mental capacity to agree or give consent to engaging in a sexual act. So the idea that a child is to blame for the actions of an adult makes no sense, essentially. And when a child is blamed for the actions of an adult, the child will believe that their actions cause the adult to act in a way. And this isn't the same as a child misbehaving and they get spanked, or a child misbehaving and they get something taken away from them. This is a complete violation of their body and of their rights. My second point is when children report abuse to adults, they can be told that they misinterpreted the situation, causing them to be less vocal about future abuse. And this relates to my first point, which is why the argument of a child being able to consent to an act, like to a sexual act, makes no sense. Because if you say that a child does not have the capacity to consent to engaging in a sexual act, you cannot then go around and say that they misinterpreted what was going on if a child understands right from wrong. Children do understand when they are being violated, and when they say so, when they say that they've been violated, they call out a violation, and an adult tells them that they misinterpreted what the situation was. It can cause them to not be very sure of themselves, and it can also cause them to not report future abuse. And we've heard cases about this all the time, where children don't report abuse and then they grow up into being adults, and then it finally comes out, and then when they're asked why they never reported such abuse, it's because they said when they were young they were told that this was a punishment for doing something wrong, or they didn't understand what was going on. And my application to those findings is that the re-victimization through Harris's nieces strongly contributed to her decision to harm her father. So more about that, when when she initially found out that her sister was going to send her nieces to go and live with her father, she tried to persuade her sister to not send them because of everything that had gone on in the past. And I believe that Harris's nieces were around the same age that Harris was when she was abused by her father. She After that didn't work, she tried to get in contact with her father to tell him to not take them, and it ended up boiling over into a fight in which Goodrich, her father, told her that, you don't understand what happened to you when you were smaller, and she was trying to get him to admit guilt, to say that, to just acknowledge what happened, and he didn't, and not only hurt her even more, but it made her angrier when she realized that he hadn't changed, and he was the exact same person that he was when he abused her. Harris reported the abuse when she was younger, but her cries were ignored. So, like I said earlier, and throughout this whole presentation, she did make several attempts to report the abuse, and the abuse, when she would report it, was always ignored. It was always either blamed on her, or people didn't want to hear about it, and these weren't people that she didn't know. These were her family members who were supposed to protect her. She made an attempt, like I said before, she made an attempt to speak to her father about the previous abuse. He denied it. He even went as far as to say that she didn't understand what was going on, and that's when she realized she had to do something to stop him from taking her nieces. She also, and like I said, she also spoke to her sister about it. Her sister said no, that he's a different person and he's going to treat them well, but she knew better than that. So here's the conclusion of the case. The long-lasting effects of sexual abuse contributed to her killing her father. She never got over the abuse that happened to her father. The abuse contributed to a lot of the downfalls in her life that she experienced because of it. And it while she was a contributing member to society, it kind of held her back from becoming an even better person. So, with all that being said, the combination of her not getting help for her trauma, and not being able to find not only support that was actually beneficial to her, but support in general, because she couldn't afford it, because good support does cost money. You do need resources for those resources, and she was not able to get them. So that also contributed to all the problems she had as well, because had she had not been traumatized in that way, she would have never needed the resources, and she would have never killed her father. Harris created her own version of justice when she attempted to stop her father from taking her nieces and saving them from potential trauma that she endured at their age. The main reason why this trial was brought up and made such a big deal, was because in the prosecutor's eyes, even though Harris had experienced all of the trauma and everything that had gone on in her life, the the prosecutor saw this as her essentially being both judge and jury in the case of her father, and the prosecutor believed she could have gone about it a different route. But as stated before, the um, the the statute of limitations had run out for her to even attempt to get any type of justice, and she wasn't essentially trying to get justice for herself at that point. She was trying to stop um, more trauma from taking place by stopping her father from taking her nieces. The jury found her guilty on a lesser charge of manslaughter in the second degree, and they even wrote multiple letters of request to the judge for her to get the most lenient sentence possible, as many of them found it difficult to even give her a guilty sentence in the first place. And this just speaks to all the events that have taken place and her character as well, because if these people were able to empathize with her and see that she had already suffered enough. Life had already handed her more than she could possibly take on, that she deserved to go free. I think that's a very big deal. However, the judge ignored all of those requests, and he gave her 5 to 15 years in prison, which many people were very dissatisfied with. They felt that she did not deserve to go to jail for that long. I believe by now she is either up for parole or has been released already. And here are the articles that I used. And thank you so much.